Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about ecosystems, so let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now when we're talking ecosystems, right off the bat we want to establish what exactly that means. So when we talk ecosystems, we're talking about an area, okay, that and the ecosystem involves everything that's there, both biotic, living, in other words, the insects, the plants, the animals, whatever may be there, as well as the abiotic, the non-living things, rocks, soil, weather, temperature, those kind of concepts. So that's an ecosystem. It's essentially everything, living or not living, in a particular area. And of course, you're going to have lots of populations, lots of communities, lots of organisms. So, for example, if you think about the prairie that's pictured right there beside me, the ecosystem would include obviously all the plants, okay, all the insects, all the herbivore insects. If there's rabbits, mice, snakes, frogs, any living thing, as well as I mentioned, the rocks and the soil, and it could also be trash around, plastic, paper, whatever. Obviously, the weather, the temperature, all that would come into play and be involved in the ecosystem. And really, it's just what we want to think about is the cycle of nutrients through. Okay, that's going to lead us into some food chain, food web talk, and certainly some decomposers and detritus eaters, as well as bacteria and fungi. So it's just all about the processes to get the materials through. Because what we can't forget is that when it comes to energy, there's only so much. There's a set amount. And the energy, we're going to be looking at how the energy just transforms into different types. We're going to look at the energy efficiency of an ecosystem. Spoiler alert, not very efficient, which is why you may see millions of plants, and by the time you get up to a hawk or a top carnivore, there's just one or two. And it's because there's just not enough energy once you get to that level. But we'll talk about that when we get the food pyramids. We'll talk about them when we get the NPP, net productivity. And then lastly, on this side, with an ecosystem, it tries to stay in balance. It tries to have as many plants as it has, producers that it can, but then as we go up to each level, it can only support so many herbivores, and they can only support so many carnivores. If you have more herbivores than what you can sustain with plants, then the herbivores just eat all the plants, and then they have to make a decision about staying, going away, whatever. And of course, then if you increase or reduce your number of herbivores, you're going to increase or reduce in relationship the series of carnivores. Now, when we look at studying ecosystems, there's 5 main ways, and there's even more than that, but this is the 5 that the book focuses on. 5 different types of ways to model or to study the relationships of an ecosystem. And the first one is listed here, holistic ecosystem model. It's really a collection of all the rest, using data to understand the relationships in an ecosystem. Using just observations, using detailed accounts of what's there in an ecosystem. It's just looking at every angle, every possibility, and then the rest of the 4 are simply a component, as I mentioned, of what a holistic ecosystem model would be. Another way to look at them, to study them, is to look at the changes. If a natural disaster occurs, maybe it's a fire, okay, maybe an earthquake has occurred, but maybe something has happened to change the ecosystem, and does it fight to get back to where it was, or does the change bring about a different environment, a different structure, as far as if you have a prairie fire, what grasses come back, what plants come back. There are some plants that are accelerated, their cycles are accelerated or started by a fire. So that is ecosystem dynamics, just studying how the changes affect an ecosystem. Okay, the next two, and the diagram over there is really a combination of the two, but a conceptual model just simply studies is a flow chart to show the path of energy, and that's essentially what food chains and food webs do. Those are conceptual models. They're just flow charts showing you if it's a food chain going from the sun to the herbivore to the herbivore. I said that. So the sun to a producer to an herbivore to a carnivore, and then a secondary, third, and tertiary, that kind of stuff. So food chains and food webs are conceptual models. This diagram also has analytical numbers, which also makes it an analytical model, because that's just simply a crunching of the numbers. Okay, how much biomass of plants and producers do we have? How much biomass of herbivores do we have? And of course, if you were looking at a 10-acre field, you certainly couldn't physically weigh or determine the biomass of the entire thing. I mean, you could, but that would take you a while. More likely, you would just do a section, maybe 100-foot by 100-foot section, and then just extrapolate the math out from that standpoint. But an analytical model would just be simply focus on the numbers, the productivity of an ecosystem. The next type is typically the type that if you use in a science classroom such as this, if you use simulations to try to showcase the processes involved in a thing. So like we've looked at plenty of those, or you've had the opportunity to look at plenty of those, and we're looking at cells. I mean, we can look at a microscope, but it's much better to look at a video of the process or a simulation. When we can look at simulations for how neurons fire. I mean, because you can't see that. I mean, you can't, even if you're looking at a microscope, you can't necessarily see the chemical processes involved in a neuron firing or things. So you develop simulations to showcase that, and that's obviously just called a simulation model. All right, the next thing we want to get into, and what we're setting the stage here for our next video, talking about food chains, food webs. So we got a series of slides here just talking about energy production and the processes and the pathways that it goes through. But a couple of things to think about right off the bat is gross primary production, net primary productivity. I should have said not production, productivity. And you should be well aware of the differences between gross and net. Your paycheck, if you work somewhere, will show you that. Gross is just simply your hours times your salary per hour, or your wage per hour. But the net is what you take home after all the expenses are taken out, taxes, and if you have insurance or whatever might be else taken out. So just like with you don't get to spend your gross, you only get to spend the net. And so when it comes to studying ecosystems, it's good to know how much total amount of energy that producers can, but typically they also look at the net, and the net is what goes to each level, that moves up to each level. Now when we're looking at food chains and food webs, and we'll see this in food pyramids, because food pyramids has the numbers which makes it a conceptual and an analytical example. But the ecological efficiency of a ecosystem is not very efficient. And the reason why is because living organisms use a bunch of the energy that they consume for their own purpose, and that's good. For example, even though it looks like a little bitty nothing blade of grass or a plant or a tree or whatever, but all the energy that it absorbs from the sunlight converts that to sugars. It uses 90% of that for its own purposes, its own well-being, its own metabolism, whatever it needs to get things done for its own existence. And so only 10% is passed on to the next level. And that leads us into why when you're driving down the road, as I do quite often, passing a lot of farmlands or wooded areas or lots of different types of ecosystems, that you can see an entire field of plants, okay, grasses, whatever, and they're producing a lot of energy through photosynthesis. But the herbivores that are out there, mostly insects, mice that eat the seeds, and birds, seed eaters, and things like that, only 10% of that energy is passed on to the herbivores. So right away, even if you set a number, say 100,000 units of whatever the unit might be, only 10,000 of that would be passed on to the herbivores. Well, the herbivores are going to eat that and take those sugars and digest those, and then use 90% of that for their own benefit, their own survival, their own cellular processes. So right away, if we start out with 100,000 of just a made-up unit, 10,000 gets passed on to the herbivores. Well, now we're only going to pass 1,000 on to anybody who comes along to eat herbivores. Okay? And not only is it inefficient system as far as the energy that's passed on, it's also an inefficient system because of the what you can benefit from eating from a snake eating a mouse. Okay, now the mouse will have muscle tissue, which just like us, when we eat beef, we're essentially eating muscle tissue, and so you're going to get those proteins, but you're also going to have bone in there, and you're going to have skin and fur, and all that is not digestible. Well, the skin possibly, but not the fur and the bones. So even though a snake might eat a mouse, only the little bit of muscle is really the only beneficial part of that, and then the rest will get either spit back out or excreted as waste in some manner. So not only is it not efficient as far as the energy, passing it on to the next level, not everything that is eaten is not accessible is not the right word, but efficient as far as energy. Oh, and I said that last part one slide too early because it's on this slide, but that's all right. Okay, so again, we've mentioned the 10% rule. We've mentioned the non-digestible parts of the organism. And again, we've mentioned all three of these, that we use a lot of the energy just for ourselves. Just like us, we do the same thing, 90%. Now this diagram here beside me, that was really big, so I had to shrink myself, but that made me better off overall. Talks about NPP, which is that net, what did the P stand for? I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, and you can see here, and it may be kind of small, but this is going to be in your PowerPoint, so if you want to pull that up, or it's also in the textbook as well. Like the first one, the Silver Springs, Florida example. It's a spring, kind of a marsh area, and you can see the long green bar at the bottom. That means it's got a big plant production. But then you can see the small little, and that's supposed to be a pyramid, but the second, third, and fourth shelf of the pyramid are so skinny because there's just not many there. So even though we produce a lot of plants and plants produce a lot of energy, there just isn't much to pass on to the to the next levels. And so that's just a example of what we've been talking about. The next ecosystem to look at, it's a grassland area, and this is kind of the one that I described. I mean, you got a long bar of plants, and then just a very small part of the blue, and then the next level of carnivores, and then the top carnivores above that. So these are just examples of what we're talking about. These would be like flow charts, conceptual, but they're also numbers, so analytical as well. And the interesting one is the one on the top right. I don't know if you can see that, or if you can make the screen bigger, or if you're looking at the PowerPoint as well. The plant or the producer bar, in this case it's not plant, this is an aquatic, the English Channel. This is an interesting one because the phytoplankton section is very small, but yet you have a lot more herbivores as the part of that. And of course, the reason why this can exist, that may be your first question, well, how can so few producers generate so much herbivores? And that's because phytoplankton have a huge offspring, just lots of reproduction, lots of offspring. So there's always a excessive amount, and they're also very efficient in producing photosynthesis and the sugars involved. So one thing as far as test, there's a further explanation of the Silver Springs, Florida example, and the English Channel example, as well as another one, the Monofuku, in the book. So be sure and find those. If you're using the PDF, just use the find or the search to find those. But there's a couple of pages that talk about all three of them. It's not long, but it does give you some more background information. And if we get to the class and you can't find them, just let me know, and I will help you do that. Alright, so the next thing we want to look at is kind of compare ecosystems. The next couple of slides we'll be doing that, comparing ecosystems. The y-axis along the bottom is the amounts that they produce. Net primary was the word I was looking at. Net primary productivity, and you can see right away that the colors are just types of ecosystems. It's terrestrial at the top, aquatic at the bottom, and then the names along. I said y-axis the first time. Y-axis is obviously the names, and the x-axis is the numbers. So you can see just at a glance that swamp and marshes, they are the highest producing for NPP, and they've just got a real good combination of plants and water. You would think that for plants, the more water the better, but if you look at the open ocean, and we all understand that, it just gets so deep very quickly, and plants just can't reach the surface, and they can't live on the bottom because they can't get sunlight. But swamps and marshes, they may be big areas as far as square footage, but they're shallow areas, so you can have plants grow all around. Lakes and rivers, even they get too deep, as we know, to grow plants far away. You get too far from the shore, and that drops. So like lakes and rivers and oceans, continental shelves, what NPP there is going to be along the edges, the shorelines. Once you get beyond 5 feet deep, that's a pretty tall plant to reach from the bottom to the top. Now there are plants that can just sit along the top, duckweed for example, and there are types of lilies that can do that, where they can just kind of sit on the top, and but even they are somewhat close to the shore, because then they can anchor to the shore, and then just through a series of runners and stolons, produce more plants, but they're attached at least to some regard to what's going on. But and then you can see with terrestrials that the tropical rainforest, for example, are the highest in producing, and that's because they just have a beautiful combination of temperature and rainfall. So they are really good at that. And then as you get further down, just like with an ocean, then terrestrial version of that would obviously be a desert, just sand, and that's just a combination of a lack of water and high heat, at least during the day. Okay, going from looking at the just the types, now looking at an actual kind of a globe map, you can see, and it doesn't take much to figure out that NPP is going to increase with temperature and moisture, and we saw examples of that. You just got to have the right combination. You can have all the water in the world, but if it's cold or it's just too deep, you're not going to get plants to grow, because that's really what we're talking about. It's the plants that we're focused on, not the amount of water. So you can see here the graph, the more bluish and purple, the better productivity you have. Reds and dark reds are low productivity, and you can kind of look at those areas and see that even with our country, we're in the kind of the upper left there, where the right half is pretty green, and so lots of NPP there. And in the left half, when you're thinking Nevadas, New Mexico, Texas, those areas, not so much. And then you get up against the coast again, and it gets more green, especially the Washington, Oregon area, California, that kind of stuff. So let's see, somewhere is this one talk about? No, I was thinking it somewhere, and maybe it was on the last one. But anyway, also altitude will affect this as well. I mean, as further up you get, the cooler it's going to be, which is going to limit productivity. Photosynthesis just needs that right, good solid warm temperature. All right, and so here just kind of really stresses what we've been talking about. And for whatever reason, it's just a different graph, and people just use different colors. But in the last one, blues and purples were good. In this case, they're bad. And what this one really highlights is what we've talked about earlier with water. Water is good for plants, but if it's too deep, where the plants can't get to the ground and get to the sunlight, then it's just not going to work out. And so here's obviously a ocean viewpoint, and then you can see that around the edges you're going to have productivity, but not so much out in the middle. And the last thing to think about when it comes to not only when it comes to we talked about how energy is inefficient, passing it on, but something that unfortunately is efficient is biomagnification. And this is simply just a process of, if there are toxins in the water, and so whatever it may be, just pick one. If the phytoplankton are absorbing that, okay, and then the zebra mussels are eating the phytoplankton, well, they're going to be taking in those toxins, and if they are slow to be broken down, then you've got an accumulation within the zebra mussels, and then the amphipods come along and eat those, and the white suckers come along and eat those, and eventually what you have is, when it gets to the top of the food chain, now you've got a very high accumulation of toxins. And of course, a fisherman comes by and catches a walleye and takes it home, and that's how it gets passed on to that. But you just have a very high, because not only are the walleye taking in some of that toxin, but they're also eating things that have been eating things that have been eating things that have been eating or taking in the toxin. So it just gets magnified at the very top. Well, that's our video over ecosystems. When we come back to the next time, we're going to talk about food chains and food webs. We'll see you then.